And my favorite celebrity in the neighborhood,
He
just
wrote
belongs
this
to
passage.
the
Wrote,
film.
finally, somebody asking this question.
Kid, by the time I was
Awestruck by all
maybe
this?
12 or
What you're
13,
clearly
I
is
realized that these people aren't in everybody's neighborhood.
The topic we've been given for tonight is famous Hollywood families, Hollywood dynasties, and we're well represented on that score. So I'm going to introduce my panelists from, let's see, that's stage right. We have Dan Ford, who is the grandson of John Ford, who directed this movie. He's also the author of an excellent Ford biography called Pappy. Next to him, we have a very familiar face to many of you, especially those of you who are fans of Turner Classic Movies, Ben Mankiewicz. Now, he has some relatives. I've already forgot. He's got his grandfather, Herman Mankiewicz, who was one of the many New York writers who came to Hollywood at the dawn of the talkie era, wrote a lot of Paramount pictures, and eventually he worked on an obscure little quickie called Citizen Kane. Then we also had Joseph L. Mankiewicz, who, if he had only made one picture in his entire career, the fact that he was responsible for All About Eve would certainly earn him a place in the Hollywood pantheon. And Ben's cousin, Tom Mankiewicz, has written a couple of the Bond movies, Live and Let Die, and I Think Diamonds Are Forever. Also wrote the fantasy Lady Hawk. And Ben is carrying on the family tradition by bringing classic movies to a whole new audience via TCM and its related activities. And then, of course, next to me we have a fellow who is familiar to those of you who've been coming here for a few years. His father was the great director William Wellman, who his Yellow Sky, which was shot up here, is one of our perennials here at the film festival. He also did one of the all-time classic westerns, The Oxbow Incident. But of course, he's responsible for a lot of great films. He directed the classic air war drama Wings in the silent era, and a lot of my personal favorites, including a lot of his early Warner's talkies, including something called Wild Boys of the Road, which may be a favorite for reasons you can discuss. Mr. William Wellman, Jr. So I think to get it started, we'll just go to some reminiscences. Dan, we'll start with you and we'll work your way down this end. What effect, to what extent was the fact that you came from a famous filmmaking family, did it have not only on your life but on your own tastes in films, on your own appreciation for the industry? Because obviously when these things are being discussed in family circles, you're getting a side of the story that's not available to the typical watcher. So I'm wondering what John Ford's influence meant on your life and how it shaped your own instincts about film and your appreciation of it.
Hesperia Christian 38, Lone Pine 14. I went to the game. What was the question? Well, how did it influence me? I thought everybody had a grandfather that, had a big yacht and a house in Bel Air and was a big shot in the movie business, What can I tell you? I thought it was an easy path to go do that and found out it wasn't. And I went a completely different path in my own career, and that's it. Here I am.
Were you aware when you were growing up that your grandfather was this famous figure and that he had done all this work revered by millions, or were they just other movies to you, or did you not really care about him that much?
You lived in a world that was an extension of the John Ford Stock Company, with the Carries, and the field photo home was the center of so much of Ford's social life and activities. He was either there or he was on his boat or he was working. And most of the experiences that we had we weren't allowed near a set, but most of the experiences we had were with his buddies, his stock company pals, Duke, Ward Bond, so on the boat or either at the field photo home.
So Ben, being the junior member of the group, I'm wondering what your perspective is like growing up in an era where, the Star Wars era, the Godfather era. What did you think when you conjured up any memories, family memories of these classic films?
Well, I had a different experience because I grew up in Washington, D.C. I didn't grow up in L.A. My father went in a different direction. My father was the smartest Mankiewicz there ever was, and would have been a screenwriter who would have made millions of dollars. But he didn't think that was a serious way to make a living. Neither did his father, who made his living that way. So my dad, politics was always really important to the family, and my dad went back east and eventually went to work for Bobby Kennedy, worked for John Kennedy in the Peace Corps, first Latin American director of the Peace Corps, then went to work for Bobby Kennedy in the Senate, and then was his press secretary in his run for president in 1968, was with him at the Ambassador Hotel in 1968, made the announcement. Many people know my father for making the announcement of Bobby Kennedy's assassination. And then ran George McGovern's campaign, and then was president of National Public Radio. And so my problem in life was thinking, no way am I gonna meet his standard. And then to have it sort of dawn on me, I don't really know. I knew that his father wrote Citizen Kane, whatever, right? Black and white. I dealt with my father. And then to have that sort of added on was you have to reconcile at some point, okay, I'm never living up to this. And I could still have a pretty rich, good, successful life, but I just have to sort of take myself out of the pressure that could easily flow from that, even though my father never put any pressure on at all.
Now, did he show you any of these films or steer to him on TV and say, hey, this is part of the family legacy?
I mean, I knew about it because they talked about it, and he would, he would have corrected you when you said, had something to do with Citizen Kane. He would have said, Ed, he wrote Citizen Kane. He wrote every single word of Citizen Kane. Yeah, that was beaten into our heads, but I didn't, I get it. I knew it was, I went to LA in 1988, not to move, to visit. I'd only been once before, and I went to a party, and somebody introduced me at the party, like Ben Mankiewicz, and they said, of the Mankiewiczes? And I go, yeah, and he clapped his feet together and bowed. I was like a junior in college. He bowed and he goes, Hollywood royalty. And I was like, whoa, I got to move out here. I got to get out of here fast, man.
So I'm sure somebody would ask this from the audience, but I'll ask it right now. How then did you get the job at TCM, and what has it meant to you to be surrounded by all these films, and has it put your own family's work in a different context?
Oh yeah, I mean, yes, the rest of that story is, of course, it has now. I got the job the way people used to get jobs. Like I got like an interview and a callback and another interview. I earned it, and but the gods were shining that day, because reading a teleprompter and telling a story, I've gotten okay at it, but who cares? Like, it's not that big a deal. So the way the job was presented to me in the beginning was that Robert Osborne was that guy, and on weekends what we're going to do is we're going to introduce you, and you're going to have Bill come and talk about Wings, and I'd interview you. And we were like, that's what we'll do. And if we can get the filmmaker himself, great. If it's his son, terrific. If it's a cinematographer, terrific. Screenwriter, we'll get some. And so I auditioned for that and had to compare The Magnificent Seven, oddly, a movie that's out again, to The Seven Samurai. And so I prepared for that and then had these conversations, and I was good at that. And then it occurred to them sometime before I got called back for a second audition that was going to be an impossible job to fill. Like, they couldn't possibly do that 3 movies on Saturday and 3 movies on Sunday. It was just too hard, and they gave up. And they were like, all right, we'll just do what Robert does. And by then, I was only one of 4 guys left. And then I got lucky. It's funny, real quick, I had the second interview. I did well, and I went home. And I failed so many auditions that I knew I'd done okay. I went home, and I said to my girlfriend at the time, I'm not superstitious, but I said, I'm going to turn on the TV, and if the movie on TCM if a Mankiewicz has anything to do with it, I'll get the job. But if it doesn't, I won't necessarily not get it. I'm just saying, I turn it on, and right, we're dead in the middle of the Barefoot Contessa. And I'm like, I think my uncle wrote and directed it, so I think that would count. And of course he did, and obviously I knew, but I couldn't believe it. It was too good. And then, sure enough, 5 days later they hired me.
So, Bill, unlike Dan and Ben, you had the experience of growing up right in the midst of Hollywood in a family where your father was working constantly, have a very long and lengthy career, and your friends, I assume, their friends, your parents' friends, were a lot of the Hollywood people. So describe what it's like growing up in that atmosphere, and how much of it seems common. How much of it is, oh, well, the Coopers are coming over, this one's coming over, that one's coming over. As a kid, were you awestruck by all this, or did you take it in stride because it had always been there?
Ed, let me tell you what my neighborhood was like. These were the people who were living within 2 streets to the east and 2 streets to the west and 5 blocks north and south. There was Henry Fonda, Gary Cooper, Tyrone Power. There was Eddie Bracken. There were the Andrew sisters. John Payne, married to Gloria DeHaven. There was Jennifer Jones, married to Robert Walker. Lana Turner. And then starting down my street, we had Fred McMurray. We had Frank Capra, Nelson Eddy. On the next street over was Red Skelton, Peter Lawford, Bob Crosby, Bing Crosby's brother, Xavier Cugat, Irene Dunn, and my favorite celebrity in the neighborhood, Hopalong Cassidy. So by the time I was maybe 12 or 13, I finally realized that these people aren't in everybody's neighborhood. So they were always coming. Their kids were my friends, some of them. That's the way it was, and my dad would take me on the sets and locations. I was here for the entire shoot of Yellow Sky. I was in Durango, Colorado for the entire shoot of Across the Wide Missouri. I went fishing with Clark Gable. It was all around me, and I really thought everyone had these people in their neighborhood.
You must have had great garage sales. I love to go to those. Well, at what point did it, I mean, how did it shape your experience knowing these people on a personal level and seeing them on the screen and later on television? I mean, what did it mean to you? How did you connect that? How did you make that connection with this is the real world and this is the cinema world?
It was just magic to me. The first set that I went on was Nothing Sacred, and Carol Lombard held me in her arms. I was 6 months old, so unfortunately I have no memories of that. But my first memory is Oxbow Incident. My father took me to the studio, and he had to shoot almost the entire film in a soundstage. We drove up, parked, they rolled up the door of the soundstage. I walked inside, and everything in that soundstage were things that I knew were outside. There was rocks and hills. There was a stream. There was trees. There was brush. And I was walking around. I remember looking at the rocks. I walked around the backside. They were fake. There was a stream here. I followed all the way to a great big hose, and I just looked around. Horses were in there and everything. And I thought, my God, this is the magic. And it was all magic to me. Every set I went on, every location I was on, I thought it was absolutely fabulous and had no idea and no thought, no dreams that I was going to be a part of it.
Now, how did you reconcile the father who, maybe sent you to bed because you didn't eat your spinach with the father who was on movie sets bossing hundreds of people around? How did you make that connection? How early did you realize, wow, Dad's just not giving me hell, he's working everybody else over?
Well, my father was a taskmaster, and he was tough, but he was fair. Everyone understood the rules. Rule number 1, do whatever your mother tells you. He was supportive of us at all times. Yes, we got spanked, and we deserved it. I have 6 siblings, so we all have our stories about that. But he supported us to the absolute end. I mean, if I had a problem in grammar school with a teacher or a principal or a student, I would never tell him, because he would be down there on them if it was my teacher or the principal of the school, so I wouldn't tell him. We wouldn't tell him certain things because we knew he had our backs to the nth degree. He even, when he was shooting in town at studios, He would wrap at 5 o'clock, and he told Mother, have dinner on the table at 6, I'll be there. And he was there, not bringing his work home, but asking us what happened in school, what did we do, what happened with this. We never felt that he was gone.
So he was there constantly. The
Yeah.
presence was...
Yeah.
Dan, getting back to you, since you had a much different experience, I'm wondering, when you began researching the book Pappy about John Ford, first of all, what was the impetus for the book? And secondly, as you were researching it, what insights did you gather, not just into your grandfather as a movie director, but as a person? You know, what did that mean to you, and how, if at all, did it enhance your own awareness of the family ties?
Well, I'm amazed at Lone Pine because they're so much bigger than Hesperia Christian, you know, and I'm really disappointed, you know.
There's one in every crowd.
Anyway, what was the question? No, how did it influence me? And
First of all, how'd you come to write the book? I mean, was it a proposal that you offered to publishers? Did somebody come to you and say, hey, you can offer a perspective?
In 1971, we made a documentary called The American West of John Ford, and it was basically a repeat of what Peter Bogdanovich had done, directed by John Ford, but it was a commercial television version. And the reason we made it was, well, we wanted to make some money, and because he had done this thing for Bogdanovich in the AFI, which was terrific, but he didn't get any money. He signed it away. So we did this as a commercial television venture, and it got me exposed to a lot of the older films that I wasn't familiar with. I was familiar with all the, you know, everything since Grapes of Wrath, Our Green Was My Valley, so on, all the post, say, 1938 ones. But this got me into films like this one, and of course The Iron Horse, and a lot of the other silents. And I really became a student, a serious student of my grandfather's work. And I started to, after we did that show, I began to understand the synergy and the reconciliation, the how of how he did this. Not artistically so much as, because I'm not that talented, but the business behind it. For example, this film that we saw tonight was an encore of The Iron Horse, which of course was a hugely successful Western. And this was shot in 70 millimeter, and it was widely distributed, but it came out at the wrong time because sound just was about to come in, and sound was on everybody's mind, and there weren't many theaters that could project 75 millimeter. So this film, as good as it didn't make money. And as a matter of fact, it helped put William Fox in the bankruptcy court, and he lost control of the Fox studio, and this film is one of the reasons, unfortunately. There's a great story about the baby, but you don't want to hear stuff like that.
I think they...
Okay, the baby...
I don't think the crowd wants to wait till tomorrow for that.
Save it for tomorrow? Okay.
No, they don't want to.
No, go ahead and tell it. Yeah.
Okay, well, the money shot in that is obviously the land rush scene, and the money shot within the money shot is when the baby gets set down in front of the onrushing horsemen and wagons. Well, there was a couple there, an extra, that actually brought their baby to this film, and it wasn't scripted. And John Ford, being the nice guy that he is, he talked the couple into, "Can I borrow your baby?" And then sent the couple off somewhere, and then he had, the prop man on the show was a guy named Lefty Huff, who went on to become the head of production at Fox, and his son succeeded him as head of production at Fox. So Lefty Huff is on the running board of a car. I don't know what kind of car it was, but it had a big running board, and obviously it had a big engine. And it was set up for a left-handed man, which Lefty Huff was left-handed. So just on the right time and the right cue, he reaches down. This was for real. I mean, there's no rear screen projection. There's no CGI or anything. There's a kid on the lake bed in front of all these horses and wagons. He reaches down and he grabs a baby, and the baby's got a little strap on him, a harness, and he reaches down the frame and grabs a kid. And I interviewed Lefty Huff about this, and he told me, I asked him, I said, what would you have done if you hadn't have picked up the baby, if you had have missed? And he said, I would have fallen on the child.
You would have what?
he would have fallen on the child. I would have gone down and covered the baby, you know. Wow.
You know, I'd forgotten about the baby shot until I saw the movie again this time. I now remember when we screened this with George O'Brien in 1979, there was an audible gasp because our people knew enough about movies to realize that was not rear screen projection. That was done before the technology had been perfected, and everybody gasped. And after the screening, one very irate older woman who was the husband of one of our film collector buddies came up to O'Brien and shook her finger in his face, saying, you know, you should be ashamed of yourself putting a baby in that kind of jeopardy. And he said, lady, I was 300 miles away. I had nothing to do with that baby. You can blame John Ford for that. And she said, well, where is he? Ben, getting back to you, at what point did you take a serious interest in these films, and did you study them, and did you have access, did your family keep memorabilia that was available to you, maybe shooting scripts or things like that?
No, we're the least sentimental family in America. My interest, first of all, so in college, and I had a moment where, of course, I knew it was important, and I'm mothered, but I was like most 15, 16-year-old kids, and I thought, I'm not going to watch a black and white movie, and I was an idiot. I'm still an idiot. I'm just less of one. And I'm just an idiot with a child, so I'm no longer allowed to be a full-fledged idiot. And my mom made me watch North by Northwest and insisted that I would like it. And the funny thing is, my memory is that I sat down and I watched this black and white movie with her. But of course, North by Northwest is not in black and white. But my mind tells me that it was. And then I went to college, and I took a film. I found out junior year you could take a bunch of courses pass-fail. And I was already a junior, and I could take 6 courses pass-fail. It was like it was the happiest day of my life. The next 2 years are going to be so easy. And I took a I had some broad name 20th century American cinema. And I took it, and I wrote a paper on the Santa Fe Trail. With Errol Flynn's in that movie, Ronald Reagan's in that movie, and it was clearly about John Brown, and John Brown was clearly Hitler because that movie I think it was 1940, I think, yeah. And I wrote a paper on it, and I was like, all I got to do is get a C. This is fantastic, and I got the only A+ of my life, and I first of all, I just remember the pain of realizing I'd taken the course pass-fail when you just got an A+. So I got a little interest then. I thought, well, maybe this is something I'd like to talk about. And specifically why TCM dovetailed so nicely is that what I like doing is putting these movies in historical context and telling the story in a way that makes it relate to people. So, but then I was a television reporter, and then all of which eventually, and I won't bore you with that story, that eventually led me to get that wonderful TCM job after not getting a job on every show on television that you've seen. Didn't hire me. I got rejected again and again and again. And then I ended up getting the best thing that came along. So, and then came this enormous crash course. So I don't want to pretend like I had no interest. I had some interest. I had some knowledge. I'd read. But I had literally thousands of movies to catch up on. And I did. And I watched so many movies, and they blend together. And as Bill learned today, don't ask me a title, because I saw them back to back to back to back to back, and I'm like, I don't know. And then you start talking about it, and I'm like, oh yeah, no, I got it. And still, even today, I'll put a movie in. I think, I don't think I've seen this, and I'll be like, oh no, I saw this 5 weeks ago. So I just. And then I just see my job as sort of telling stories about these movies, and I know that my grandfather, everything I know about Herman, he'd be like, so you make your living talking about the art of other people? And I'd be like, if I were able to, I'd be like, yeah. And he'd go, and they pay you what? And I'd tell him, and he'd be like, that is fantastic. He'd be very pleased he'd be stunned that this world existed, that people come here to this festival with this kind of interest in these movies, and that you guys know and love and watch TCM, and that I can sustain hours and hours of conversation just talking about these movies. He would never. That's one reason why he wasn't sentimental. He didn't keep anything because to him, it didn't mean anything. It meant nothing. He sort of constantly felt shame that he wasn't back in New York, writing for the theater, or at least reviewing for the theater. He thought that was more substantive than writing these movies. He was wrong, but that's what he thought.
Well, that whole generation of writers who came at the dawn of talkies, when the silent film scenarists with their hoary old plot formulas were kind of out, and everybody wanted dialogue and the sophistication of Broadway shows. And I should know this by heart. I can't remember if it was Herman or if it was Ben Hecht.
It was Herman.
It was Herman.
It was Herman to Ben Hecht.
Okay, so he cabled him, millions to be made out here, and your only competition is idiots.
Yeah.
So that encouraged a lot of these
Let me
New
just
York-
give him the whole line because it's good. He cabled him, said, "Look, you can make 300 a week, but that's nothing." And then it goes on. Forget that. There's millions to be made out here. Your only competition is idiots. Don't let this get around. you got to remember the last line. It's too good. Yeah.
So, Bill, when you growing up and being immersed in this whole thing, when did you decide? Was there a pivotal moment? Was it a moment on the set with your father, or was kind of a gradual thing that convinced you, I want to be a part of this. I want to be a part of this industry and part of this art form. Was there a specific thing, or did it kind of creep up on you?
It was a phone call.
From?
My father. I was back after my freshman year from Duke University taking business administration, and I get a phone call. My father's at Warner Brothers preparing a film, and he says, "Bill, what are you doing now?" I said, "I'm just hanging out this summer." He said, "Well, the head of publicity and head of casting have this idea that maybe you should play me in this movie." And I said, "Play you?" He says, "Yeah, the movie is about the fighter pilots that I knew, the guys, the buddies that I had in the First World War, and I'm one of the characters. And you're about the same age that I was when I went to France in the First World War, and they think it might be a good idea for you to come and play me. Do you want to do it?" And I said, "Yeah." So he says, "You're going to have to test for it." I said, "Okay." So he gave me a scene to learn, and I went and I had to do it live in front of Jack Warner and all the heads of everything at Warner Brothers and my father. And the way they had a huge table, Jack Warner and his entourage sitting behind this table, and all of the prospective actors were sitting out there in like school chairs. And that we were called up like one at a time, and we would perform right there. And no actor wants to have to do an audition with other actors sitting there watching. So I tested with Tab Hunter. My father originally wanted James Dean for the lead, and then he was killed. Then he wanted Paul Newman, and Paul Newman and Jack Warner were fighting. Newman was mad at the projects they were giving him. And Warner said, "You can't use Paul Newman," to my father. He says, "I'm going to put him on suspension. But I think you should use Tab Hunter. He's my blonde superstar." And Tab Hunter in the 50s was kind of the Tom Cruise of the 50s. So I tested, and fortunately for me, Tab Hunter's the kind of a person that when he's nervous, it shows. And my nervousness didn't show, although I had volcanic eruptions going on inside me. So, I finished, I went home. And my father came home and he says, "All right, you got the job. Everyone passed on you, even Jack Warner." He says, "But there's going to be no favoritism. Learn your lines, do your job, no messing around." I said, "Okay." That was nothing new. I'd heard that from him about 100 things. So it was about the second day on location. They started filming on location first. And about the second or third day, I went to my father and I said, "Dad, I love this. This is what I want to do." Now, I was supposed to go back to college second semester. And my mother wanted me to go back to college, and so did my father. Now, neither of them went to college. My father was kicked out of high school. My mother had to quit school during the Depression to try to get work, but they wanted me to go to college. So it was amazing to me. My father, like the first time, he supported my decision, and he even he told Mother, he says, no, Bill's going to do this film. He'll go back to college second semester. It'll be good for him. He'll have some money, for college. It'll be a good experience. So there I am. I'm an actor. I never went back to college. My father seemed to be happy about it. And many years later, when he started writing his memoirs, he wrote in an unpublished book, "I can't believe my son became an actor. I can't believe it." And at first I was shocked when I read that, but then I thought, it was kind of neat because as fathers, we always try to move our kids, in the right direction if we can. Even though he didn't want me to be an actor, he realized that it was important to me, and he stood behind me.
At what point did you decide that you wanted to get involved in the production end of things as opposed to just acting?
Every actor, you're not getting the roles you want. Well, I'll make my own movie and I'll give myself the role. Every actor has this in their mind. And I tried doing some producing, and I did do some producing. But I really didn't like it. I kind of like the idea, the actor's sort of an independent person. He kind of does his own thing. He's not really beholden to anybody. In production, and I worked on several films as a producer, and you're beholden to a lot of people. And I didn't really like that.
Your dad's, one of his great pictures, of course, we've already talked about the Oxbow incident, and one of the three men, for those of you who've seen the picture, who's about to be hanged is an old fellow named Francis Ford. And Francis Ford, by that time, was a character actor working not only in John Ford films, but the films of other directors. He himself was quite a star in the early days. He was a director. He started working for Thomas Ince way back in the Nickelodeon era. He went to Universal, and with his partner Grace Cunard, who not only was the female star, she also wrote and even directed some of their shorts together. They were a very powerful box office team at Universal in the early days. So Dan, I'm wondering, as you were researching the book on John, who of course went to work at Universal on some of those early films, I'm wondering what you found out about the family that you never knew. Were there family legends that had been kept from you that you found out while you were researching this book? Anything exciting that made you understand more about the family?
It was a close family. It was an Irish immigrant family. His father had been a saloon keeper in Maine. And Maine was the first Prohibition state. It was the home of Neil Dow, who was the father of Prohibition, or the mother of Prohibition. And he ran several illegal saloons in the waterfront area of Portland, Maine. And most of his customers were, of course, Irish and other immigrants who worked the docks or who were seamen off the ships. And that's what he did. And it was a family business. They had several saloons. And the oldest brother, Pat, he always stayed in Portland, and he was always, he was like the character that in My Darling Clementine, when Fonda says, Mac, you ever been in love? And J. Farrell McDonald, he plays a bartender. He says, no, I've been a bartender all me life. But that was his brother, he was that kind of guy. And anyway, they were a close family, and a lot of them came out here. And a lot of camp followers came out here. A lot of the ladies in the family came out here and worked in various capacities in the business. Interestingly enough, one of John Ford's favorite nieces, Cecil DePreta, she went to the Philippines as a representative of the Max Factor Makeup Company, and she had a big job out there, and she wound up being interned by the Japanese in World War II. I don't know how I got off on that, but a lot of the family followed him from Maine, out here and went into the business. His brother Eddie was the first AD on this movie, and that's it, you know.
So when you were researching, was there anything that you came up that really startled you about the family in terms of their relationships with other people, or the dynamic that existed between them? Anything that really surprised you based on what you may have known about the family before?
Not really, but I know that Eddie was older. You mean there were three key players in the business. There was Francis, who was the initiator. He was the one that came out here first, and he had been in theater, and he was a professional actor who gravitated to Hollywood and became a film actor. And then Jack and his brother Eddie, they followed him out, and they all worked together. The dynamic. Eddie and Francis were older brothers, and Jack was the pushiest, most aggressive. He was the youngest of 13, of which about 9 survived, which is pretty good in Maine.
How much older was Francis?
Francis must have been about 15 years older. Francis, the oldest one was Pat, who never came out here, but Francis was number 2 or number 3, and Eddie was like number 5, and Jack was number 13. He was the youngest, and he was also the smartest, but Francis spread himself too thin. He was an actor, he was a producer, he was a writer, he was partnered with Grace Kennard, he wanted to buy a studio, he wanted to do this, he wanted to do that, where Jack Ford was more focused. Jack Ford just wanted to be a director. He just wanted to make movies. You know, he didn't want to own a studio, he didn't want to control a library, he didn't want to do this, he just wanted to be on the set and make movies, and he always was like that. You know, he was happiest down in front of the camera saying action and telling other people what to do. Eddie wasn't as ambitious. Eddie, of the three of them, he was the most scholarly. He was always the one that they would ask, would have Lincoln, Abe Lincoln, would he have really said that? You know, Eddie would know. You know, Eddie was just a voracious reader, and he was the most academic of the three.
Ben, even though your experiences were considerably different growing up, now that you've been working for TCM, you get to interview not only people who worked on these films, but other historians and people who've studied them. I'm wondering what you've learned about your family members that has come as a surprise to you, if anything, that you didn't know before you started working with TCM.
Well, I learned a lot. Among them, of course, one of my favorite stories, which involves Dan's grandfather, where he saved, you know, Joe Mankiewicz's stewardship at the Directors Guild in like 52, something like that, but right in the middle of the loyalty oaths. And Peter Bogdanovich, there are a lot of versions of the story. Peter Bogdanovich, I think, tells it best. And I'd be interested to get Dan's reaction, because there's a way to tell this story and there's a way not to tell this story. But the short thing is that Cecil B. DeMille was pushing loyalty oaths for the Directors Guild, and Joe was running the Directors Guild and didn't want to do it. And the story is worth reading. The Directors Guild has a great piece on it, which everyone should read, but it's 20 pages. But the bottom line is nearly every major director in Hollywood was on one side or another. Many were cars and motorcycles driving at 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning to try and sway people from one side to the other. And they have this late meeting where DeMille is making his case. DeMille overplays his hand massively and refers to some of the directors like Fred Zinnemann and William Wyler, and he refers to them with an accent emphasizing their immigrant Jewish statuses. Fred Zinnemann, William Wyler. But it could go either way, and Joe could be thrown out, and DeMille could win the battle. But everyone's waiting for one director to speak, because there's really only one director who could settle this, and then John Ford has been sitting there, as Bogdanovich tells the story, with his hat, scowling most of the night. It's 1 o'clock in the morning, smoking a pipe, right? Pipes, right? And then finally, talks go back and forth, and then finally, John Ford stands up. And according to Bogdanovich, it has to be said like this. He goes, "Yeah, my name's Jack Ford, I make Westerns." the story's so much better if he says Jack Ford. I don't know why, but it's way better if it's Jack Ford. I'm Jack Ford. I make westerns, and essentially he says, CB, nobody knows better what America wants than you, but I don't like what you've been saying tonight. Let's all just give a vote of confidence to Joe Mankiewicz, go home, get back here at 8 o'clock in the morning, start making some pictures. And that was the end of that. And that ended it. Like he hadn't said anything, he hadn't weighed in on one side or another, but that settled it. And then ironically, about 8 months later, Joe Mankiewicz agreed to loyalty oaths. But without pressure, like of his own free will and volition, and without a sense that directors were being pressured into it. So, a really significant moment, and that's like almost the only story, the only John Ford story that my family has, but it's a good one.
Andy.
Yeah.
Bill, I don't want to let the evening go by without, since I made an allusion to one of your dad's early talkies for Warner's, which, by the way, of all the famous, there are a lot of famous William Wellman films. There's Nothing Sacred, and there's Oxbow, and there's a million of them, Wings. I personally really love, and they play on TCM often, he made a lot of gritty Warner's pictures in the early 30s, beginning with Public Enemy, but a lot of them were social consciousness pictures. Warner was great at that. And he directed Richard Barthelmess in a great silent star in Heroes for Sale. But I alluded to a picture called Wild Boys of the Road, so maybe you can explain to the audience why that one is particularly important to the family.
Well, my father had met my mother. Now, this was about to be his 5th marriage. See, my father would marry anyone who would date him twice. And he felt that the way this works is when everything is going good, when it's hot, that's when you get married, and you worry about learning about each other sometime later on. And it never worked out, and he took credit for messing up these marriages until he met my mother. Now, the trade papers had a field day when they heard that my father was going to marry my mother. Because here's Wild Bill, his 5th marriage. Of course, at that time, they thought it was 4. We found out one later on. And 37-year-old Wild Bill is marrying an 18-year-old Busby Berkeley chorus girl. Now, how long is this going to last, right? It lasted for 42 years for the rest of my father's life. And they were a completely devoted couple. And my father worked in many of the great musicals in the golden age of Hollywood. All the great dancing musicals, Gold Diggers of 33, Show of Shows, Kiki, all these wonderful films. And she was prominent in them and loved to dance. When she married my father, now they were secretly married at this time, my father talked her into being the female lead in Wild Boys of the Road. It's it's a Depression-era film. The youth leaving home, taking trains to other cities, trying to find work. And I think he dressed my mother in Louise Brooks' wardrobe from Beggars of Life, which was a train picture of a kind of a Depression-era sort of film. And my mother did the role, and Warner's wanted to put her under contract, and my father didn't want her to do any more acting, and my mother didn't care about it. She wanted to have a family, and that's what my father wanted, so they spurned the Warner Brothers offer.
And her name, by the way, her screen name was Dorothy Coonan. And it can't be underestimated how good she is in this picture because she's surrounded by a bunch of other boys. She's dressed, as Bill just referred to, she's wearing slacks and an oversize. She's trying to pass for a boy. She's got her hair tucked under a cap. Same outfit that Louise Brooks wore in the silent Beggars of Life. And it was a terrific performance. And this is an actress making a performance. No glamour, no great lighting. She's not getting the makeup or the costumes. But the depth of emotion that she shows in that one performance really makes me believe that she'd done a lot more dramatic roles.
And Dad gave her a little dance number. She got a little dance number in it. But the picture, well, it was an important picture for my father because he was ready to leave Warner Brothers. He was happy with a lot of the films that they gave him, but he was still a term contract director, meaning whatever script they gave him, he had to make it. Fortunately, he brought Public Enemy to the table, but that was really the only one of, between 1930 and 1934, he made 22 films.
Between what years?
1930 and 1934, 18 under the Warner Brothers contract, and he was getting too many. My father loved to make different kinds of films. He wanted to make every kind of film. And all of a sudden, the woman in trouble theme sort of took over. And they were giving my father one script after another about, you know, floozies and madams and prostitutes and one after another. And he started squawking. Yeah. And he started squawking to the head office, and so they loaned him out. They loaned him to MGM to do a picture called Midnight Mary. What do you think that is? With Loretta Young, and Loretta Young was giving Warner's trouble, so they had loaned her out too. So the two of them made this picture, and it ended up being one of my father's favorite films. But when he came back from that, he decided that he was no longer going to be a term contract director, and he was going to go out on his own. So when he got Wild Boys of the Road, he thought, well, I better wait a minute, because he really liked this. And he decided that he was going to make all the decisions. He wasn't going to listen to Jack Warner or Darryl Zanuck or anybody. This was going to have his fingerprints on. And casting my mother was outlandish, you know. They had some other people. The studio wanted some other female stars, but he wouldn't have it. And he shot the picture. They kind of screwed him at the end. They made him shoot a second ending. And the studio took the other ending that my father didn't want. But I really think the studio was right, because it's a kind of a depressing film, and there's a little bit of an uptick at the end where where my father wanted the kids to be incarcerated, if any of you have seen the picture. So I think the studio did the right thing. But my father then left and went out on his own and was able to pick and choose.
And it definitely is worth seeing, by the way, if you get a chance. Wild Boys of the Road, Midnight Mary, which not only plays TCM regularly, but it's one of the Forbidden Hollywood DVD box sets. So we want to give you plenty of opportunity to ask your questions. I'm sure you have them. Larry Maurice has got a mic. I would repeat what he asked, that you please give us your question clearly, distinctly, and succinctly, and we'll do our best to answer it. You can ask any of the panelists, and we'll start here in the front row. I'll call on you. Yes?
I would talk to Mr. Matuzak here.
This is a question for all three of the panelists. Your personal favorite Western feature-length film, number one, and number two, your personal favorite barroom fight scene in perhaps a different film.
Did everybody hear that?
Question is, what's your favorite Western and what's your favorite barroom brawl scene?
Dan, you want to start that?
My favorite John Ford film is not a Western. It's They Were Expendable. I'm sorry. I apologize. I'm a boat guy, and I get nervous when I get more than 10 miles away from the ocean. I only like horses when they win. I apologize. It's a weakness.
I don't think he was just meaning John Ford, though. I think your favorite Western,
No,
right? Is that
I
what
know.
you wanted?
I'm thinking. There's so many of them. Everybody says the Searchers, but that's too obvious. I like My Darling Clementine, you know. I just really do. My favorite barroom scene would be, well, it would probably would be from The Quiet Man. It's not a Western, but it's just this ongoing fight scene. It's the whole money of the whole movie's built up gearing towards this fight, and it's terrific.
just because we just started talking about our favorite John Ford movies. I have a crazy favorite John Ford movie, also not a Western. It's The Last Hurrah with Spencer Tracy, which is just so great. Look, one movie we're showing here, and I'm not saying this just because he's sitting here, but no question the Oxbow incident. First of all, it's like 78 minutes, and any movie that's under 80 minutes is okay by me. And then I'll be honest. I'll go 92. Unforgiven. I can't. That was that's a movie that I could have mentioned that made me reevaluate every other Western I'd seen. But by the way, that said, I think my favorite Western's Ride the High Country. But Unforgiven, I didn't see Ride the High Country except because Unforgiven made me think, maybe I should revisit these movies. I was, 25 then. So that made a big, and I don't have any idea about barroom scene. Although Unforgiven's got a good barroom scene, ends with Gene Hackman getting shot in the face. Yeah.
Shane.
That's a solid pick.
I've seen it so many times. My wife forbid me to put it in the player anymore at one time. I mean, I can look at that at any time. I absolutely love that. And
that qualifies for both, the barroom brawl
yes,
and
I'm going to
Best
say
Picture.
that's the barroom fight. And I love The Searchers, and I don't really have a number 3 because there's so many Westerns that I like that I'd have to sit down and really study to come up with others. But Shane and The Searchers are my 2.
Nothing wrong with those.
Okay, another question. Larry, we've got someone right here.
Okay, I thought I was loud enough, but all right. I finished a book a while back, and particularly for Mr. Ford, but for the other folks here on the panel, it was 5 who came back, and it was about directors, and it was about the experience of these 5 directors that probably everybody in this room knows about, and their experience with the impact that World War II had on them, and their service, and how it really changed their lives and the dynamic of their films after they went through this experience. And if people
Great
are
book.
familiar with
Great book.
Is there a question in here somewhere?
I want to hear what they thought about that book.
Great book. Ford, Weiler,
Stevens,
Stevens,
Capra.
Houston, and Capra. Yeah, it was terrific. And what's staggering today is these men, over draft age, would take time out of their careers. They were at the peak of their careers. They were at the top of their money-earning potential. And to take time out and go work for Uncle Sam for $200 a month, And what they did for the war effort in terms of the propaganda effort and help mobilizing the country and educating troops and everything they did is just outstanding. Netflix was trying to do a show on that. I don't know what happened to it. Probably in the current climate, it's not desirable, but maybe someday somebody will do a cable show on it.
Now, Dan, your grandfather did some incredible work on his wartime films. Were you familiar with those at all before you started
You
researching?
couldn't be
the book?
around John Ford and not be familiar with his war record and his war films and the Navy and everything. His Achilles heel was the military, and it was the Navy. He would drop, no, I'm not going to make that movie. Tell Duke I'm not available. And he'd run to Taiwan and make a stupid documentary for the Navy. I mean, he would do anything for the Navy. It was really, it was outstanding. I mean, it was.
And by the way, George O'Brien was a Navy man. He's the only man I ever knew personally who served in World War I, World War II, then went in the Korean conflict as part of the Naval Reserve, and also did a tour in Vietnam. That's pretty amazing.
Let me just say quickly, one of the best thing I have done at TCM was a 5-part series. I think it aired in late 14 or early 15 with Mark Harris, who wrote 5 Came Back. And each we devoted a night to each director. And it was some of the movies they made before the war, the movie they made immediately before they went to serve, immediately what they made after, and then the documentaries that they made. it was a seminal experience for me to talk about that. Especially, two of those guys, Weiler and Capra, immigrants who were determined to sort of contribute to the war effort. And, changed them dramatically, changed their films, but nobody got changed more, you mentioned Shane, than George Stevens. I mean, the movies that George Stevens made before the war it's like two different directors, two incredibly talented directors, but just completely different. And what he saw, specifically at the concentration camps, completely changed his perspective on what movie making could be and what it should be. And that day I spent with Mark talking about that book and those directors, by far the best thing I've done in 13 years at TCM.
You big-footed Netflix. That's why they didn't make it. You beat them to it.
Bill, how about you? What are your feelings on these films, the wartime films? Have you read that book?
No, unfortunately, I haven't read that book. But of course, my father was in the First World War. He had just been kicked out of high school, and he told his parents, "I'm going to France." America was not even in the war, and he said, "The reason I'm going, it's either war or jail." And off he went, and he became a decorated fighter pilot in the Lafayette Flying Corps. And that experience really possessed him throughout his life. I mean, he made 11 films of aviation, but all of his films harkened back to those young pilots that he knew, and he went to war with other friends from his neighborhood, and he met other friends when he was over there, and nearly all of them were killed.
He was shot down.
Yeah, he was shot. Well, he had 6 major air crashes during the war, and the 6th one sent him home. He was shot down, and his back was broken in 2 places. They put a silver plate in his head, which strangely enough, he would have these headaches, and he went into the hospital many years later, and it had dissolved, the plate. So, he had lots of problems from the war, but he never forgot those young adventurers, those pilots, and also the French pilots that he flew with.
More questions? There we go.
I'm coming.
Yeah, much younger. You're lucky you haven't read it because you'll love it. I'm going to read it. 5 came back.
Pardon? Okay.
So, Ben,
Yes.
the silly little anecdotal lies that you sometimes tell and then take back,
The anecdotal lies that who tells? and
that
takes?
you do, the little sort of false stories that didn't happen, and then you take it back. Do you think that stuff up yourself
Yes.
ahead of time?
Believe me, I'm the only person who writes something
Or-
and then has to say, okay, that obviously didn't happen.
Yeah.
yeah.
So do you plan it, or is it just getting happy on the set? In the
No,
moment?
I plan it. I get the scripts about anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks before we shoot. No, really 1 to 6 weeks before we shoot, and then I fix them, every single one of them. I go through it, I change it. Some of them I change 100%, some of them I change 40%, but I put myself into it. That's the part of the job I like least, because it takes a really long time, and sometimes it's just it feels really mechanical, that work, and it doesn't feel terribly creative sometimes. But then, every 3rd or 4th script, I'll think of some idea that'll strike me as so unbelievably funny when I'm writing it, and then I'll do it. And the problem is, I'll do it in the most sterile environment ever. Here it's wonderful. I love talking to live audiences because they'll either laugh or won't, but I'll get an idea of whether it works. But then you do it in this sterile studio, and you got a crew there. There's 10 people there, but they can't make a sound. So I just look for some reaction. Did the grip guy lower his head because he's laughing? Or is he dozed off, right? And then I'll see it on the air, and then like 6 weeks later, I'll wait on Twitter, and I'll see somebody say, "Hey, that was funny," and I'll be like, "Yes, fantastic." So anyway, thank you.
We got time for 2 more questions.
And
more.
I want to, Ed will remind you also, but we're probably going to continue this discussion tomorrow night also with a few of our same panelists and talking a lot more about John Ford. And what are we doing tomorrow night?
Three Godfathers
Yeah, exactly.
with John Wayne.
Right, so going to be great.
And the Oxbow incident before.
Yeah.
And the Oxbow incident before that.
Question?
The phenomenal 78-minute Oxbow incident.
Any more questions?
I have a question, if I'm permitted.
We have somebody down
For
here.
Ben,
Go ahead,
yeah,
ask
as
your
I'm
question.
moving there. Ben, when you review a movie, how do you do it? Do you have your own criteria that you go in and say, do you have do you use a number scale? Do you use seat belts? Or, I mean, what's your you look at a movie and you say,
Do I use seatbelts?
oh, I used to do, yeah. Does it take 2 or 3 or 4 seat belts to hold you in the seat to watch this thing?
No, I review movies for a show called What the Flick on the TYT network, and but you know I took over for Roger Ebert, which is not an easy job, so I did that for a year, and I was more serious about the criteria then. Now I sort of feel like I'm with these really smart critics, and I sort of see myself as more of an everyman. So the criteria is different if it's If it, I don't like horror movies terribly, but so I can't then give a bad review to every horror movie. So you have to, you have to understand that that's the genre you're talking about, and you put yourself, you rate the movie. But I know I'm coming at that from a weak point, so I'm probably a little fairer. Like I bend over backwards to make sure, because I don't have any interest in criticizing somebody else's art. So I try to find something nice to say. That probably makes me a worthless critic. But I see myself as leading a conversation about the movies, less so than, but then I end up giving it a number. I feel much more comfortable hammering a director who doesn't need me, like Michael Bay. Like I'm comfortable giving him a 0 because he doesn't care. But when we get a first-time filmmaker who's put their heart and soul into something and it doesn't work, that's a very tricky spot for me. So I will try to find something good to say and then give it a bad number, but it's tough. I don't, I love talking about movies, but that is a balance that I'm still not fully comfortable with.
Final question.
But by the way, watch What the Flick on the TYT network online. I don't know how many of you guys are online regularly, but it's a fun show.
One more question. Who had one over here?
Oh, that's okay. Oh, he's coming back. Okay, it was a John Ford question, so I'm glad it's
Ask
there.
it slowly till he gets up here.
I'll take it real slow. John Ford was both infamous and famous for putting actors in the doghouse. Some of them are very famous, but did that carry over to the family life? Were there certain relatives that got in the doghouse?
Finally, somebody asking this question. Like, was he the worst grandfather ever? Was he as tough on the family members as he was on the actors?
No, not at all. He was tough on his son, my father, but they had a kind of a tortured relationship. But the rest of the family, he was particularly the extended family, he was very gracious to, and he was a pretty good family man.
Okay, well, with that, we'll wrap it up. I'll remind you that Dan Ford, Ben Mankiewicz, and William Wellman Jr. will be back tomorrow night after Three Godfathers to discuss John Ford's career in more detail. I want to thank you all very much for coming out and hope you enjoy the rest of the festival. Thanks a lot.